Welcome to the Crazy Alchemist podcast, where alchemy, occultism, and strange history come alive.
In March 1895, in a cottage in Ballyvedlia, County Tipperary, Ireland, a cooper named Michael Cleary held his wife down and poured a mixture of herbs and urine into her mouth. When that did not work, he doused her in lamp oil and set her on fire. She died. Cleary told the neighbors he had not killed his wife. Bridget, he said, had been taken by the fairies. The thing in the cottage was not her. He was not insane. His relatives had helped. The local herb doctor had supervised the procedure. Cleary expected Bridget to appear at the nearby fairy fort of Kyla riding a white horse, and he planned to cut her free with a knife. He waited at the fort for 3 nights after the killing. She did not come. At the trial, Cleary was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 20 years. The jury accepted that he had acted under genuine belief. A children's rhyme circulated in Tipperary for years afterward. Are you a witch, or are you a fairy, or are you the wife of Michael Cleary? This happened in 1895. Oscar Wilde was writing plays in London. Roentgen discovered X-rays that same year. The Age of Reason had been underway for 200 years. The Changeling belief did not care. The Changeling story follows the same script across all of Northern Europe. The details barely change from Ireland to Norway to the German lands. A healthy child is born, the parents rejoice. Then something goes wrong. The baby stops growing. It cries without ceasing. Its face looks old, pinched, wrong. It eats and is never satisfied. It does not learn to walk or speak at the expected age. Something has changed. The child the parents brought home from the birth is no longer the child they are raising. The explanation? The fairies have taken the real child. In its place, they left one of their own, a creature that looks like a baby but is not. The changeling is sometimes described as an old fairy disguised as an infant. Sometimes it is a sickly fairy child swapped for a strong human one. Sometimes it is a wooden log enchanted to resemble the baby while the real infant is taken underground. The Irish called them Seog children. The Germans called them Wechselbog, exchange child. In Scandinavia, the Beitinger or Shiftinger. The Polish had the Odminets. Every tradition agreed on the symptoms. The changeling was sickly. Its head was too large. Its limbs were thin. Its appetite was bottomless. It had an old face on a young body. And every tradition agreed on one more thing. This was not the parents' fault. The child had been taken. The thing in the cradle was not theirs. The moment of greatest danger was the first few hours after birth. Every culture that believed in changelings had a system of protection designed to keep the fairies out during that window. Iron was the universal shield. Open scissors placed above the cradle or under the mattress, iron tongs propped against the crib, a horseshoe nailed above the door. In some regions, the father's knife laid across the baby's chest. The belief that iron repels fairies appears across Celtic, Germanic, and Scandinavian folklore with no clear origin. Nobody knows why iron specifically. Baptism was the other critical defense. An unbaptized child was exposed. A baptized child was claimed by the church, sealed by holy water, named before God. The urgency to baptize newborns in medieval Europe had a practical edge beyond theology. Beyond iron and baptism, the protections multiplied. Rowan branches near the cradle, red thread tied around the baby's wrist, a Bible placed under the pillow. The mother was never to be left alone with the child in the first days. A fire was kept burning in the room day and night. The fairies hated fire, hated light, hated watchfulness. If the protections failed and the parents suspected a swap, the next step was to make the changeling reveal itself. The most famous method was the eggshell brewery. The mother would take a dozen empty eggshells, fill them with water, and set them to boil over the fire, as if she were brewing ale. She did this in full view of the suspected changeling. If the child was a fairy in disguise, the absurdity of the act would overwhelm its composure. It would sit up in the cradle and cry out something like, "I am as old as the hills, and I have never seen ale brewed in eggshells." The exclamation proved the changeling was ancient and the game was up. In some versions, the changeling flew up the chimney the moment it spoke, and the real child was returned to the cradle. This story appears in Lady Wilde's Ancient Legends of Ireland. It appears in the Brothers Grimm's Deutsche Sagen. The antiquarian Wirt Sykes traced a version of it to 7th century Gaul. The eggshell test is one of those folklore motifs that refuses to stay in one country. The line between testing a changeling and torturing a child was thin, and it was crossed constantly. In Norway, the prescribed method was to whip the suspected changeling on 3 consecutive Thursday evenings. After the third beating, a hag would supposedly appear at the doorstep with the real human child under her arm. In parts of Wales, the cure involved bathing the changeling in a solution of foxglove, a plant that is medicinal in small doses and lethal in large ones. Children died from foxglove baths administered by parents trying to drive out the fairy. In County Kerry, Ireland, in 1826, an elderly woman named Anne Roche took a 4-year-old boy named Michael Leahy to the River Flesk. Michael could not walk or speak. Roche immersed him 3 times over 3 days. On the 3rd day, the boy drowned. At the trial, Roche told the court she had been bathing the child to put the fairy out of it. The judge directed the jury to acquit. She had not intended to kill the child. She had intended to cure him. The changeling belief was not confined to illiterate peasants. Martin Luther wrote about it. In the 1530s, Luther encountered a suspected changeling in Dessau. A child had been born who could not walk, could not speak, ate constantly, and screamed day and night. Luther called it a massa carnis, a lump of flesh with no soul, placed by the devil. His recommendation was blunt. If I were the prince or the ruler here, I would throw this child into the water, into the Moldau that flows by Dessau. The princes of Anhalt refused. Luther then recommended daily prayer to drive the devil out. The child died 2 years later. Luther did not believe in fairies. He believed in the devil. The mechanics were different. The result was the same. A family with a child that did not develop as expected had a supernatural explanation and a supernatural license to act. The fairies of changeling tradition bear no resemblance to the small winged creatures of Victorian children's books. The Victorian theory was a sanitized product, stripped of danger. The fairies of Irish, Scottish, and Scandinavian belief were the people of the mounds, older than Christianity. They lived inside hills, beneath lakes, inside ancient ring forts. They could be generous or lethal, and the rules governing which were not always clear. Ireland still has roughly 40,000 ring forts. Roads have been rerouted in modern Ireland to avoid disturbing them. The folklorist Kevin Danaher wrote in 1964 that fairies had been the best protectors of ancient monuments the country has ever seen. The medical explanation for the changeling is solid, and it accounts for most of the symptoms. Susan Schoon Eberly published a paper in 1988 arguing that changeling descriptions match developmental conditions closely. Failure to thrive produces exactly the symptoms the folklore describes: a child that eats but does not grow, that looks old, that does not reach milestones. Conditions on the autism spectrum can produce sudden behavioral changes, withdrawal, and loss of early language. The economic dimension matters too. A child with severe disabilities was a catastrophic burden on a pre-industrial family. The changeling belief allowed parents to redirect blame away from themselves and toward the fairies. All of this is persuasive. It explains why children with developmental problems were singled out. It explains why the cures were often lethal. It does not explain why the belief is nearly identical across cultures that had minimal contact with each other. The changeling belief appears in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Poland, and the Czech lands. The core details are the same. A healthy child is swapped. The replacement does not grow. Iron repels the beings that took it. Fire, water, or violence might reverse the swap. The skeptical reading says the changeling belief was a pre-scientific framework for disability and infant death. The pattern across cultures reflects the universality of those experiences. The other reading says the pattern is too specific for that to be the full explanation. Iron protection is not a universal response to fear. The eggshell test is not an obvious invention. Both readings are defensible. Neither can fully explain the other away. W.B. Yeats collected fairy stories across the west of Ireland and took them more seriously than most of his literary contemporaries. In 1889, he wrote a poem called The Stolen Child. The refrain runs, "Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand." Every parent who lost a child to illness and called it a fairy theft was doing two things at once. They were explaining what had gone wrong, and they were telling themselves their real child was somewhere else, alive, in a place beyond reach, but not beyond existence. Michael Cleary waited 3 nights at the fairy fort for his wife to ride out on a white horse. She did not come, but he waited. That is the thing the medical explanation does not touch. He waited because the alternative was that he had burned his wife to death for nothing. The fairy story was the last wall between a man and the knowledge of what he had done. Somewhere in that gap between the medical fact and the human need, the changeling tradition lived for 1,000 years. It lived because it answered a question that medicine, even modern medicine, answers incompletely. Why this child? Why mine? The fairies did not answer that question either, but they turned it into a story with a structure, a set of rules, and the possibility of reversal. The iron is still on the door, the fort is still in the field, the question is still open. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with your thoughts. You can find the full written article with sources and further reading at crazyalchemist.com.
If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to visit crazyalchemist.com for more intriguing content and follow Crazy Alchemist on Instagram and Facebook to stay connected.